That's a kind of novelist way of kind of attempting to dramatise the discourse of fear. There is something historically familiar about all this, of course, and perhaps that's the trouble in terms of no one panicking or reacting sufficiently. No matter how galvanising the statistic, the article, the photo, the film, the book, no matter how many times we are told that this situation, this damage, this unnatural species pressure is unprecedented in human or even planetary history, and that word unprecedented came up Monday evening, Andy Watson, it feels like an old trooper of a trope, more rhetorical than real. How else to explain the lack of terrified screams to the recent revelation that sharks have been reduced by 90% in 10 years through overfishing, instead of leading to the mass closing or even destruction of restaurants serving shark fin soup? There was barely a belch. Not even Tony Blair came rushing on with this week's solution before he got bored with it or found it didn't pay him enough. Sharks aren't cuddly. Or maybe there's some deep down hubristic satisfaction that we're elbowing out a species so ancient, so efficient, so much more perfectly adapted to the world than ours is. No, I think the secret is in the repetition of old patterns, old warnings. I'm currently writing a novel featuring a violent and half-crazed medieval felon called Robert Hodd, the imagined unromantic precursor to Robin Hood. After much research over several years, I've come to the hoary old conclusion that nothing in the world is new. In the Middle Ages, according to the great historian G.G. Coulton, writing just after the First World War, quote, "Men's minds were constantly haunted by the apocalypse and the more dismal chapters of the prophets. Much of the unprogressiveness of the Middle Ages in certain directions may be traced to this numbing belief in the imminence of the last judgment." End of quote. Climatic horrors, from thunderclaps heralding endless rain to the earth heaving and belching forth fire and brimstone, methane in the modern version, are also chilling features of the medieval doomsday. Coulton regarded the period as, quote, "a long process of suffering and convalescence from the barbarian invasions, that time when another decadent way of life, the Roman, its riches similarly dependent on slavery or others' extreme poverty and a disdain of the natural world, collapsed because no one panicked enough. We tend to think of the Middle Ages as more dynamic than convalescent, and might see Coulton as suffering himself from post-trench fatigue, projecting his wounded present onto the past. But its contemporaries, the medievals, were certainly aware of the fragility of their times. St. Gregory the Great, for instance, was in no doubt that we were, quote, "at the very end of the world's existence. Let us do what we can." 6 centuries later, in about 1250, the distinguished Oxford teacher Adam de Marisco wrote to Pope Innocent IV, complaining that, quote, "the world is now in its old age, and we are come to the end of all things, so that it is already as if Satan were loosed, and those horrors were abroad which St. Paul foretelleth." His exact contemporary, Roger Bacon, weirdly ahead in so many things, reckoned that, quote, "the times of Antichrist are at hand in these days of ours. God, indeed, in his infinite goodness and long suffering of wisdom, doth not at once punish mankind, but delayeth his vengeance until the iniquity be fulfilled. But now the measure is full." This is the template of most contemporary ecological writings. We've got away with it up to now, but not for any longer, or not for much longer usually, with a wafer-thin margin of a few years to stop the reader plunging into despair. Now the measure is full. There's nowhere else for the wickedness to go. The wickedness materially realised as pollution. Pollution itself being a rather sinister term in medieval theology, attributable to lepers, Jews, heretics, and so on, and blamed on Satan and his demons, the most effective cure for which was burning. Our society is iniquitous too. We are rich, wasteful, and horribly decadent and need to change. St. Gregory and countless others, especially the hermits and visionaries, would have known exactly what the problem was. There is even, as we heard on Monday night, as we heard yesterday, a revival of the notion of sinning in relation to pollution and its necessary companion, guilt. I sinned in coming here by flying and driving. Expense was no real excuse, because if I was truly good in the old sense, I would have stayed at home. And now, as in the medieval period, we can measure our sin quite precisely, even scientifically. Sin was cancelled in the old days by the absurdly corrupt system of indulgences, and in our own time by the equally absurd notion of carbon offset. Both are systems suited to the wealthier. They can sin and appease their conscience without noticing it. Did the average medieval sinner believe in all this cash pardoning? The historians are divided on this issue, but the truth is probably somewhere in between. They both did and didn't simultaneously. This wasn't simple cynicism, although there were no doubt quite a few who believed only in appearances, but the same old human capacity to fool itself. The secular West has found its own way to be profane, and its own way to salvation without passing God or going to jail. Yet more science, in fact. The scientists are our modern-day St. Bernardinos, haranguing us in the square, desperate to sow panic and galvanise us into action. The objection that they caused the trouble in the first place is answered by a formula familiar to medieval ears. The greatest sinners make the greatest saints. Just as the rich and often murderously powerful men of the pre-Enlightenment could consider themselves Christian, despite leading their lives in complete contradiction to their professed leaders' rules of poverty and love, happily slaughtering or burning both each other as well as Jews or heathens or whatever, so with scientists. Chemists, for instance, have happily continued to introduce the environment to a multiplicity of artificial molecules, from pesticides to plastics, without considering what happens to those molecules once the product is discarded. A primary school child could have told them that it all ends up in the sea, that it doesn't just vanish, not even after many hundreds of thousands of years in many cases, and that this is a very bad idea, particularly for living creatures. It is as if chemists are too stupid to finish the equations they started scribbling on the board, cutting them off in the middle. But we don't think they're stupid. I might have loathed chemistry at school myself, with all that evil-smelling fug and incomprehensible formulae, but this is no basis for believing its practitioners are demonic fools. Far from it. Our plastics-dependent society worships them. They are our modern-day priests. So how come they are all such appalling scientists, by the very standards of rigour and precision that they themselves apply? How was it, for instance, that the researchers for ICI could claim the first hormonal herbicide, MCPA, tested in secret during the war, and after the war in collusion with IG Farben, who of course made the Auschwitz gas, how could they believe it was harmless? Were these brilliant experts lying, or just weirdly ignorant?